Hello everyone, welcome to the next video in the series. In this video we're going to look at the Rust system and how to start playing around with it. So the Rust system is based off of vertex color, which means when you place an object in your scene, you can come up here into the Paint tab and start painting in your vertex color. Or you can import your own. But we're going to be playing around with the painting system right here. So when you open up one of these Rust materials in the instance, you can see it only looks like Rust. And the reason that is because this material right here only has a full value in its vertex colors. So to start revealing away the actual paint, we have to change the actual vertex color. So if I was to grab this object and I just filled in the 1 value, you can see it just looks like Rust. Not really impressive. But if I was to fill this in with black, you can see that I get my paint. So there's a couple of different values which affect the Rust value. So if we type in a full value of green and we start painting on our vehicle, you can see that this gives us the highest value of our Rust, which is basically a 1 value. So this is where you want all of your Rust to be completely enveloping your surface. If we were to change this to red, you'll see that we don't get full values, but we get Rust as well. And what I like to do is first go in where I want my Rust, and then go in with this brush to kind of break up the harsh edges. And the next we can do is start changing the parameters within the Rust to get even more fine control over the look. So if I pull up the Rust, I can see that there's a couple parameters here which I can play around with. Rust amount. That is literally the amount of Rust on the entire surface. So if I bring this way down, you can see that it's basically invisible now. And in this instance, we can't really trust what we're seeing here in the viewer. You have to look at your object in the scene because that's what you're going to be using in your game anyways. So best to keep your eyes on here. The next thing we can affect is the bump. And you can also play around with Rust color if you want to give this a little bit of a tint. The next thing is the color contrast. So you can play around with the actual contrast of this texture. And then the next few ones are actually affecting how our masking system works. So if we click on Rust contrast and we start playing around with this value, you can see that it's affecting the contrast of our mask. So this gives you fine control over the difference between your red and green channels in your vertex colors. So contrast 2 is changing the other channel. You can see with the combination of these two, you can get some really interesting looking results. The Rust mask amount is also going to change how much Rust we see on the entire surface. If I change this all the way down to 0, it's basically applying the entire mask across the surface. If I raise this up even higher, it acts as a separate, different kind of contrast. Generally at a 0.2, or at a 2 rather, we get a pretty nice value. Rust metallic value, you can play around with this as well. And the repeat, which is very useful for getting in the right looking Rust on no matter what your object's UVs are set to. And then we have the Rust roughness right here, and you can see that in the actual editor over here. If you wanted a really shiny Rust for some reason, you can plug that in right there. And something really cool about this system is that you don't have to use this Rust texture, which I created. You can come down here into the Rust texture and plug pretty much anything you want. In this case, I have 3 different variations of the rust texture. So by default, I have the 2048, but if I wanted a higher value, I could throw that in. If I wanted something much lower, drop that in as well. You can plug in whatever you'd like. All the same parameters are going to control the contrast and everything. It's just going to take a little bit of time to play around with. But yeah, you are not limited by this texture. You plug in whatever you'd like. The next thing we can do is start playing around with the grunge on the different layers. So if we were to go into our reflections, we can start playing around with the grunge, add more or less. We'll actually bring our reflections up a bit and then start playing around with the grunge and the contrast. And we also have grunge on the base layer. And you can play around with the roughness of that, and you can see right away how it starts affecting the entire surface. So if you wanted a really, really grungy surface, you can start playing with these values. Alright, so that's just a general overview of the Rust system. Of course, you don't have to use just Rust. If you wanted to, you could plug in pretty much any kind of texture you want here. You can do dust, you could do snow, you could do pretty much everything you'd like. I added Rust as a default because many cars need a little bit of Rust every once in a while. But you are not limited by just this one texture. You can plug in whatever you'd like and start playing around with right away.